Philip, I was thinking a little bit about the supply chain recently. It's been in the news. There's lots of people talking about it. Tons of articles and so on. And it just reminded me of the first time I ever heard the phrase supply chain versus when most people have heard about it. And it's funny. I was talking to some friends, and they said, the first time I ever heard the word supply chain actually came up during the pandemic. And they start recounting these stories of, going to the grocery store, finding things that were missing, finding the things were missing. And it reminded me a little bit of, my own personal experience with that. During the pandemic, I made the decision that I was going to do most of the grocery shopping for the family. And so I would go out every week. And my wife, being glued to the television, during the pandemic, would say things to me like, hey, make sure that you get extra toilet paper. And of course, every time I go to the grocery store, I look there and I'm like, there's all this toilet paper. So why do I got to get extra toilet paper? I'll just come the next week or what have you. And I was like, you're full of it. It's never going to be a problem with toilet paper. Sure enough, one week I go in, I turn the cart into the paper aisle. Nothing. There's no toilet paper. I shouldn't say that. There actually was toilet paper. The problem was that the brand that my wife wanted, there was no toilet paper. So I remember thinking to myself, okay, what is the story I'm going to tell my wife when I get home? And there's no toilet paper.
Supply chain story.
And anyway, it was one of those moments where, my wife looked at me, with disdain and said, told you so. But, for a lot of people, like I said, supply chain, has suddenly become a big problem, right? Over the pandemic. What's your take on that?
Well, when it comes to TP, I think it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think people, I don't know what the panic was about getting more TP with this pandemic, but whatever it was, it did create some problems on that. But specifically in supply chain has been an issue and affected a lot of industries. Clearly, we have some issues with not just our suppliers, but for instance, in my business, which is like more technology or consumer electronics and components like that. The fact that over the decades, we, the U.S. and a lot of other global partners have built or allowed an ecosystem to be built in Asia, specifically in China, and then the pandemic hit. It wasn't as easy as just taking your stuff and manufacture it south of the border or some other country, because you needed this ecosystem to support the manufacturing of whatever you were manufacturing. And that affected a lot. I mean, everybody's feeling it nowadays. So that's an issue that is not easily solved, at least not immediately, because it didn't take just 1 year to build that ecosystem. We've allowed it to build over many, many decades. But I have felt, on a personal note, for instance, the pain, the chlorine tablets from my pool. I used to get a 50 count for like about $70 or so. I was just checking recently; it's like almost $240.
Wow!
Like holy crap! So that's affected a lot of the prices. And eventually we'll go into maybe another podcast about inflation and so on. But supply chain it is an issue. I know for some of the products bringing across the ocean, the cost has gone 3-4-fold. So that's affecting, of course, a lot of the availability and pricing.
I was wondering, as I heard some of these stories, whether some of the supply chain pressures that we've seen was a consequence of things not being manufactured, or it was around delivery, or it was around a variety of things. And I had a conversation with a colleague not so long ago, and he works. In fact, he's a supply chain leader, and one of the things he was talking about was semi-conductors. Right? He was talking about how there's been this. A lack of semiconductors for certain products. And it's funny, when you read about this, they don't often go into what those semiconductors are being used for, right? Are they being used for vehicles? Are they being used for consumer electronic devices? Are they being used for toys? What it is. And around the same time, I began reading a little bit about the M1 chip, right? The Apple's M1 chip, because I was thinking about getting a new laptop and so on. And I said to him, I said, hey, I imagine with Apple buying all the chips out there, you guys are struggling a lot. And he said, no. He goes, there are plenty of other semiconductors that, can be manufactured for lots of other products. He goes, that's a real high-end chip. And he goes, and there's no issues with those. He goes, it's the small-end chips that are the bigger problem. And he recounted how it is that, many of the electronic devices that we use, many of the cars, for example, they use less advanced technology, but there's, a lack of those chips. And that really was the heart of a lot of the problems that he was experiencing. Your company does a little bit of that work on electronic devices. I mean, did you guys experience anything like that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Anything that has to do with, microchips or anything of that kind of components has been in short supply. And the reality is that when we had the pandemic, for instance, hit, a lot of people found themselves at home. And since you couldn't spend the money going out or traveling and doing things, you spent it in two ways. Many times it was just investing in your house, building that extra room, the outside, the patio, the pool, whatever. And then a lot of electronic components, right? A better camera, better PC, so all of these things created a higher demand, and there wasn't enough supply for it. That compounded with the fact that, there were some health and supply issues in countries, specifically in China, right? In Taiwan, actually, when you also have those issues. So that restricted some of the availability of the components and the higher demand. And you have this perfect storm where, things are just coming into like not enough components, not enough widgets, if you will, for whatever our demand was increasing, not just here in the US, but globally.
Sure. Well, it's been going on for a while now. What's your sense from a business perspective of whether there's an end in sight?
So, wow, that's we could do a podcast on that alone. I'll tell you why.
$64,000 question.
Yeah. So the understanding, or I think a lot of people say, like, look, this is going to, get a lot better around the second, third quarter of this year, 2022, right? Eventually we're going to have this catch up of supply and demand and so on, and we'll have more availability. That may be true. In fact, I think it is true to a great extent. I do think there's another side to that, which is how supply chain is evolving, right? I mean, I've seen some developments coming up as, supply chain as a service because of all the headaches. I think some companies are going to be rethinking if they need to put all the eggs in one basket, specifically in one particular country, of managing all of their ecosystem, because let's face it, as a matter of fact, I think recently there was an uptake or a resurgence of COVID in a particular city or province in China. So that's not going to stop. So there will be an ease of this supply chain shortage or headaches right now in next 2 or 3 quarters. But there's also going to be a rethinking of how to manage supply chains.
It makes sense. I was reading an article recently. In fact, it was the New York Federal Reserve talked a bit about the supply chain issue, and they have proposed a new measure. I think it's called the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index, if I remember correctly, the GSCPI. And this Global Supply Chain Pressure Index is basically a measure of a lot of other little measures, which they look at in order to figure out whether the supply chain issues will continue. And they look at things like air freight costs. They look at things like, the number of containers that are being used to ship products and things like that. And, they've predicted that we probably reached a peak on our problems back in August of last year. So August of 2020. And they're suggestion is that by mid-year 2022, so very consistent with kind of your company's outlook on it, that we should see a lot of those pressures begin to subside. So it's possible that your chlorine tablets may become a little cheaper in the near future, just in time for the summer season 2022. Hopefully that brings you a little bit of joy.
I mean, look, hopefully, but I think there was some kind of a plant where they make the chlorine tablets in the US actually that got burnt out, destroyed. I'm not 100% sure that affected prices and availability. But, you know, some business practices, I think, when it comes to supply chain, need to be optimized. You know, the good old demand supply balance, review and measure your data, you know, very analytical on what you need to have. Understanding the supply chain, the health, and the capability of your supply chain partners, right? Building your network, having options. I mentioned earlier, you know, supply chain as a service. There are some companies out there that are saying, like, you know what, this is too much of a headache. My idea would be to focus on my sales and marketing piece of it and let me partner with someone that can actually get this done. Because let's face it, on all of these challenges, when it comes to bringing stuff over from the other side, the big companies, while they suffer, did not suffer as much as the little guys. Great. Why? Point. Because they had the big contracts, whether it was with, you know, a big freight forwarder or big, you know, UPS, whatever. They can have those influences to bring some product to this to the US, right? Or whatever market they wanted to. The smaller companies did not. And those were most challenged to be able to get stuff across. Because not just cost, but also it's not a matter of cost sometimes, it's a matter of, do you have the space?
That's right.
And that was a challenge.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You know, one of the things that I also read was about, you know, smaller providers, whether they were restaurateurs or they were, you know, plumbers or what have you, you know, house builders, and how it is that their normal supplies for the, you know, raw materials that they use to do their work, you know, sell what they sell, had dried up. And what they found themselves doing was, rather than paying wholesale prices for a lot of those raw materials, they began to have to pay retail prices. They literally were beginning to shop in grocery stores, for example, for eggs, or they were, you know, going to the Home Depot for, you know, towel racks, as an example. And, you know, you begin to see the knock-on effect, right? Because if, in fact, they're paying more for their raw materials, you wind up having to pass that cost on to the consumer. And I suspect that, you know, more of us have experienced that than we actually know, especially those of us who, you know, frequent smaller, you know, companies for the things that we buy, whether it's products or services. Is that your take too?
It is. It is. And I like to mention something, because when we talk about supply chain, we're talking about making sure we meet the demand, right? Or whatever we were selling or providing, you know, can we do this? I was just listening recently, post-holiday season, I think it's over 20% of the sales, right? For many retailers, sellers, whatever, now they have to deal with the returns.
Oh, right.
Right. So that's reverse logistics. And while it's not a supply chain, I would challenge the fact that, look, if you have all of these sales going in, but 20% is being returned, do you have that properly, you know, identified and what your true market share should be? I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, sure.
Definitely something we could talk in a different podcast.
Absolutely. Well, that's our quick take on some of the supply chain issues. We'd love to hear yours.
Yep, by all means. I hope you guys find this interesting. And if, you know, we can help in any way, let us know. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, you know, give us a comment. We'd love to hear it. Until next time, be good.
And do good.
And do good. Take care.